I'm Tom Leschine. I'm director of the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. I study environmental decision making and in particular responses to pollution events and pollution prevention. As in many human organizational and institutional planning efforts, we discovered that on the one hand there were lots of gaps and holes identified in Exxon Valdez that were filled through, we thought, through the passage of the Oil Pollution Act, principally that we would rely on a method called unified command to bring all the actors together, get everybody on the same page and coordinate much like a military response in a battle action, actually modeled after fire response, major forest fires. And we thought that that would solve the problems of Exxon Valdez, but it turned out it did not. I think in large measure, because we discovered that the political situation had changed. There was a fundamental mistrust in government. There was already a political discourse going on about this president who represented liberal values and an oil spill that occurred in a traditionally oil-dependent area, governors all being Republican governors, the political war already starting, and I guess beyond that, citizens themselves have become much less trustful of government. So I think in some ways the first casualty of the spill was not a bird or fish, but rather it was public trust and confidence in government. And we're still living with that today, nearly a year later. Yeah, the compensation question is a really important one, and we have a system whereby we have developed these fairly elaborate structures for the public resources that are damaged by a spill to be properly enumerated and a bill essentially presented to the responsible party for payment. This always goes to litigation. So the effort, because the stakes are so high, the effort to count the damages appropriately is considerable, and it can take on a life of its own, and it certainly did in Exxon Valdez, where ultimately there was a payment of some close to $1 billion, I think, 900 million for unspecified damages. It was interesting that in order to arrive at this judgment, Exxon was allowed to get by without pleading guilty to any specific harm to any single organism even. It was rather a kind of a generic claim. It was what suited all the participants in this very long and drawn out court case. And so we have a system in place that was maybe sharpened and honed, although maybe that's not the right way to put it, because there were battling economists on both sides, and at one point a national panel was established of very distinguished economists who, as I recall, basically concluded that these methods we have to put dollar values on damage are pretty limited, and you probably can't go to the bank literally on the basis of what we do. And so there was some changing in the system, but I think we're really at the very early stages now of the same battles playing out in the Gulf spill. And one thing I've noticed is that the natural scientists and social scientists both want to do studies appropriate to their disciplines to figure out what are the effects on communities of organisms in the seas and on the shores, as well as to human communities. And what happens, though, is the logic of where the funding is coming from to do the studies is colored more by the determination of injury. So that might mean that you study the economically valuable organisms, the shrimp fishery in the Gulf of Mexico, to the exclusion of studying some, insignificant from the standpoint of direct injury organisms or mechanisms that were harmed by the oil, because there's no money at the end of that pipeline. So scientists often feel that there's a distortion that takes place when you see an oil spill as an opportunity to learn something about how ecosystems recover from these insults that humans keep throwing at them, ultimately as missed opportunities because of this need to satisfy a courtroom, basically, where the game is put a dollar value out there that a judge or a jury will sustain, and that's the primary end. So what's really disturbing is people should really be getting lessons learned out of these events. What did we do wrong? What can we do better next time? And the need to satisfy these legal claims pushes all that stuff aside too. So we don't have those public airings of this is what we think we learned the way we should. I think what we've learned in the literature is that it's, we used to have this idea that there were things called acts of God and that humans were not responsible. And of course there were lots of humans who were anxious to sort of put that rhetoric out there because then that took the blame off them. So I grew up in western Pennsylvania, and before I was born we had the famous Johnstown flood, and this was clearly a dereliction of many people who created an unsafe condition. And sure, it took a big rainstorm to unleash the fury of the waters impounded behind the failing dam, but the dam was built, and so things go. So now there's an idea that it's pretty hard to have a pure natural disaster. You just have to look at the earthquake and tsunamis that just happened in Japan, where what's dominating the news day after day is not the terrible tragedy of the tens of thousands potentially lost and made homeless by the tsunami itself, but by the runaway nuclear power plants that everyone is trying to get under control. So here we have this human agent where in hindsight we say surely they could have built those plants to withstand this kind of an event. They thought they had designed these reactors to a condition where they would withstand a tsunami, which was a foreseeable event in that part of Japan. And they thought that the backup power supplies and so forth would be available, but we had the perfect storm of events, earthquake followed by tsunami, took out the electric transmission lines because the backup generators were in the basements of the plants, and because the seawall was overcome by the tsunami, the backup generators were flooded, everything failed, and there's this kind of idea about disasters that you have multiple failures in sequence that shouldn't all happen, but the stars misalign. Humans had something to do with that misalignment, and there we are. And of course, in the end then, people are looking for blame, and we get a lot of rancor and blame, properly in society, and people now in Japan are having to question how much they trust their own government, how much they trust nuclear power, and indeed, everybody in the planet is asking these same questions about how safe is nuclear power really, because the industry has sure gone out of its way the last 20 years, since 3 Mile Island, in fact, to convince us that we've got it under control now. Now it's a safe technology. So that's a question that I think is going to be subject to scrutiny again, and it may set us back once more on moving toward this nuclear future that presumably is going to save us from global warming. Yeah, that's a really good question. What are the lessons that we as educators need to pass forward, because the world certainly is changing. We're recognizing that the forces that we as humans have loosened upon the planet are maybe bigger and ultimately more malevolent. The fact that we can change the planet at planetary scales is something that was not recognized when I started into graduate school. If you go back further in time, in fact, until the 1960s and 70s, we had this idea that the seas were inexhaustible. That was the title of a famous book, The Inexhaustible Seas. It was the idea that you couldn't really harm the oceans. The vast bounty was so great that this was going to be the ultimate salvation of humankind. But here we are with half or more of the fisheries on the planet overfished or fished at their total capacity. So we discover that's different. And so what are we going to teach our students today? Well, we have to make them be able to step back and look at what are oftentimes very local problems where there's a tendency to kind of want to wade in with the sleeves rolled up, and a kind of an idea that there's a relatively simple solution here, maybe to take an advocacy position on a problem, to recognize the full complexity, to recognize that there are inherently problems that do not have simple answers. In fact, in the social literature, there's a term for problems like this. They're called wicked problems, that any attempt to solve them triggers unintended consequences in other domains, or the attempt to make one group of stakeholders in a problem happy means that you will offend others. You end up with a condition of tragic choice, it's called, where nothing you do really will address the problem. The energy future of the planet is starting to feel that way. So I think we fundamentally have to give our students these perspectives, this ability to step back and almost look at problems from 30,000 feet as well as in extreme detail at the local level, which is also meaningful. So how we get governance systems to properly reflect what is required in order to really solve the problems we're facing today is a challenge that I think the program at the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs is perfectly aligned with, because we are recognizing that you're not going to solve problems with natural science alone. You're not going to solve problems with social understanding alone. You've got to put everything together. The students of the future are going to have to be able to work in interdisciplinary teams with people who have knowledge and understanding that they don't have, and to which they will bring knowledge and understanding that their team participants, others, don't have. Those people are going to have to work together and keep together for as long as it takes to work out solutions. That's what we really have to convey to students today. We would like to think so. You know, we don't really understand what the next thing coming our way is, but I think in the idea that is, say, an oil spill, the kind of, a tanker going aground and so forth, or a commercial ship, which is maybe even more likely, where it's the fuel, which can be hundreds of thousands of gallons that we're spilling. I think, in the worst case, we could have a rude awakening. We could discover oil everywhere. Through the San Juans, the nightmare that everybody has. And I guess I would say that we probably are better able to hit the ground running than lots of other regions are, because we've got people that have a history of working together. We have fairly high levels of safety in our maritime transport in this region, and I think a lot of that has come not just through agency action and industry, but through pressure from the public. The idea that an event like a big spill really is unacceptable here. So we're in a pretty good place, but I wouldn't get too optimistic about the meaning of that for future events. I think events can turn ugly fast when the thing that happens is not what anybody expected, and when what's called hindsight bias comes into play, where many people wake up in the morning saying that was a lurking danger that some people understood, but they didn't tell us, and now look at what's happened. And that's the kind of heuristic that humans go through many times when a disaster occurs. Somebody else knew about this, didn't take proper precautions, and now I'm mad as hell. And that then can lead down the road that we saw playing out in Louisiana and the other states over the Deepwater Horizon spill.